The value we assign materials influences many of our behaviors. Where aluminium was once so valuable, only Napoleon III had a set of cutlery made out of it, we now use the abundantly available material for disposable beer cans. That material valuing practices play a great role in the lives of most jewelers is, of course, no secret. Having only recently completed a wedding ring commission, I was once again not only delighted in the opportunity to make work from this beautiful material, honing my goldsmithing skills, I was also confronted with the increase in the price of gold. With gold having been connected to several historic monetary systems, our relationship with gold and its role as luxurious material in society is complex. When reflecting on the practice of making a luxury item of jewelry in gold as part of a commission, it is definitely a practice we have seen many examples of throughout time. Gold, as we know it best, is not really a material that gets distributed fairly or even gets worked on in cooperation. But there is archaeological evidence for spectacular gold work in stateless societies, providing compelling proof that complex technologies could be sustained in the absence of coercive powers or perhaps those with the means to commission. With cooperation being a key to tackling some of our greatest global concerns and fair distribution of materials such as gold and access to luxurious objects and ethical ambition, this piqued my interest. For this reason, I reached out to the researcher who has been tracing our fascinating relationship with gold and other luxurious materials in various places and across segments of time, Professor Marcos Martinón-Torres. He is the Pitt-Rivers Professor of Archaeological Science at the University of Cambridge and researches the archaeology of alchemy and metals, investigating different forms of craft organization, knowledge transmission, innovation, and value systems. To talk to me today about his research and how looking back can maybe inspire moving forward. I'm super excited to welcome Professor Marcos Martinón-Torres. Welcome, Marcos.
Hello, I'm very excited too. Thank you for having me.
Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and what it is that you do?
Well, I am, as you were saying, an archaeological scientist, which is, I suppose, a particular breed of archaeologists. And what makes me slightly different from others is that instead of specializing on a particular region or a particular period, like most archaeologists, my area of specialization is the use of scientific techniques to address archaeological questions. So I work between the field and the laboratory.
And so you have degrees in history, archaeology, and archaeological science, and are now the Pitt-Rivers professors of archaeological science at Cambridge. But what inspired you and continues to inspire you to choose a career in academia and archaeology?
Well, I suppose the shortest answer to that question would be my father, because he was the one who, at an early age, instilled in me the interest in history, archaeology, and art. The slightly longer answer would be that I have found archaeology a great way of meeting people, both people in the present and people who are no longer here and that we meet through archaeology. So you broaden horizons, you basically learn about other ways of being in the world, other ways of thinking and interacting with one another, which is, of course, very interesting. At the practical level, in doing this kind of research, I think archaeology allows you to tackle some fundamental humanities questions, who we are, where we come from, why do we act the way we do, but at the same time has something tangible, the archaeological materials and the practicalities, in my case, of handling these, going to the field, spending time in a laboratory, and so having, in my view, the best of science and the best of the humanities, really. And then you're asking about academia in particular. What academia brings to me is the broader intellectual environment, but very specifically students. Students are the constant supply of blood for our brain. They are what keeps me on my toes as well as awake at night sometimes, but it really is what keeps me motivated and active and engaged.
I can definitely relate to that as well. So your research interests center around material culture and technologies, the context of innovations and knowledge transmission, and you share a particular interest in metals, including gold, tracing manufacture in places around the world from prehistory to the recent past. So where has this fascination for metals and these related craft technologies come from for you?
Well, I think there is another short answer for that, which is basically that metals are the most important material category in the archaeological record. Though, of course, you would say I am biased, so I'll try to substantiate that. I think, as you know very well, of course, from a perceptive, sensorial dimension, metals enable a repertoire of colors, scenes, textures, sounds, and materialities that are virtually impossible to obtain with other materials. And partly because of these particular properties, they are prone to permeate every arena of social interaction. So you have metals in the modest cauldron where you boil your food, but also in the coins that you use to pay for that food or that cauldron. You have metals in the piece of jewelry that you give to a loved one, but also in the weapon that you use to kill them. Metals were arguably the first material to create a global world in the Bronze Age, when tin is traded across the world. But at the same time, metals are largely what led Europeans to the colonization of Africa and the Americas and beyond, with consequences that we are all aware of. And then from a technical perspective, as you know, in finding, making, and using metals, there is countless examples of ingenuity, creativity, design, challenges. So there's so much of interesting metals from the pure technical perspective to the more anthropological one, that I think it's the material that keeps giving as an archaeologist.
Because your research has focused sometimes on gold as well, is there a specific reason why gold is of great interest to you?
Yes, I have a broad interest in a lot of metals, but gold is one that is perhaps particularly appealing because it provides a very interesting balance between the universal and the specific. So gold is got some properties that make it unique, that we are well aware of. One of them being its yellow color, which of course no other metal has in the pure state. Its extreme malleability and ductility. Of course, the fact that it never tarnishes, its stability. And as you were mentioning before, rarity, which is a very particular aspect of gold. Now, those are universal properties that are the same regardless of when and where you are. But then this same material is turned into many forms, is given multiple uses. So it's versatile to allow all kinds of designs, different forms of technical dexterity, ingenuity in technology. So again, it's interesting in allowing for the art, the craft, and the science, both in terms of its design in the past and in terms of our study and appreciation in the present. And then specifically, I like gold because there are perhaps some assumptions about gold being having the same value always and everywhere. However, as archaeologists and doing comparative studies, we can see that this is not the case. There's a lot of variability in how gold is obtained, valued, and used. And gold is not just about wealth and status. So it is a very good proxy to understand cultural diversity.
For those listening who maybe do not quite know what an archaeometallurgist is, could you tell us a little bit more about this practice?
Sure. Archaeometallurgy is a term we sometimes use to refer to a subdiscipline within archaeology that is concerned with the study of metals. So generally, we try to understand how metals were produced, worked, used, circulated, and valued in different contexts in the past. And so in practice, this means that often, where we can, in addition to studying the metal objects themselves, We may also study production debris, the tools used as a workshop, the slag, the crucibles, the tongs, the furnaces, the mines, etc. And also it does mean that we tend to use a lot of scientific techniques, from the field survey through to the chemical or microscopic analysis of artifacts and so on. So that's what we do.
So in researching projects, you have often investigated the object produced by these goldsmiths, and then also you mentioned tools and anything that might be waste from making as well. What is so interesting about craft practitioners from an archaeological perspective?
I think that craft practice is interesting from many perspectives. One of them is that in looking at craft practice, we can see that there are many ways of achieving broadly similar objects or materialities. So there's 100 ways to skin a cat, right? And so, as I'm sure you will agree, you know, every jeweler has their own way of producing their wire, or to soldering bits, or designing something. So that's a fact that we can reconstruct to some extent, doing scientific analysis, putting things in the microscopes, etc. But then what becomes more interesting is why different craftspeople do things in slightly different ways. And usually that is a combination of your learning tradition, who taught you, but also what you have developed as an individual, the broader context of what materials and resources and techniques, etc., are around you, the broader social organization, what demand there is, the cost, the value, the price, the expectations from whoever your commission or your market is. And so from the narrow focus on an individual technique, you can spiral out and talk about broader social structures and look at innovation, knowledge transmission, the sorts of things that I'm interested in more broadly. And so, yeah, I suppose that's why I find craft and craft organization interesting. Plus, of course, it's just on a day-to-day total privilege to be able to observe and appreciate just the dexterity, the skill, and the creativity of individual artisans. And you value objects so much more, I think, when you look into how they were made, the human, basically the cultural, what turns natural materials into cultural objects is the human hands. And I must confess, you know, I was, as a child, never, like most children, I suppose, never particularly interested in jewelry. I just thought it was the kind of thing that older people would wear, perhaps just to show off. And through looking into how jewelry is made, I've come to appreciate it a lot more.
Well, in your career, you must have had the opportunity to handle some pretty extraordinary metalwork pieces. Could you tell us about one or two memorable experiences you've had with a piece of metalwork?
Wow. Yeah, I've been lucky to handle many special objects, and so I'd need to give you two or maybe three. We'll see. Okay, I'll start with the earliest. So the earliest, somewhat humble but also spectacular, would be some iron beads about 3000 BC, so about 5,000 years old, that were excavated in a child burial in northern Egypt. And this child was buried with a necklace containing carnelian, gold, lapis, and iron beads. Now, iron we tend to regard as a rather worthless metal that you wouldn't expect to find among gold and lapis lazuli. The peculiarity of these beads is that they are the earliest iron objects that we know of, way before the Iron Age, way before iron metallurgy had been discovered. But through our analysis as part of a broad team, we could demonstrate that they had actually been hammered out of a meteorite. So this was meteoritic iron, an iron that fell from the sky, that somebody picked up and hammered to turn into beads. Hence, why this metal was, at that time, like your aluminium, very rare, very special, and deemed worthy of being buried with those. So that's one of the special objects, those two or three iron beads. If we go to the Americas, where I'm doing a lot of work now, and just to mention a gold object among many spectacular objects that I have had a chance to handle, I suppose a rather iconic one is the Muisca raft from Colombia. This is relatively small. It's the size of a hand, an object that was made by the lost wax casting technique, which I'm sure your listeners will be very familiar with. And it represents a raft made of reeds, on which we have standing several characters. One is a special one that's carrying various pectorals, nose ornaments, etc. And then an entourage of other people carrying masks, maracas, palms. So it's a very rich iconography represented in a small object where every character has been drawn, as it were, with coils of wax, which then became gold. And we have demonstrated really through technical examination that the whole thing was cast in a single pour. So there's not a single joint in the whole object, which must have been really challenging to create with wax, then to turn into a single mold, then to pour. So technically, it's very interesting, but it's also interesting because the scene it represents is thought to be the ceremony of El Dorado, the Golden Man, which was a very important ceremony for the Muisca indigenous communities, but it also became important for Europeans as the spur for the quest for El Dorado and all the rest of it. So that's another pretty special object. I could tell you more for sure. I'll give you one last one if you let me, to move to a different metal, bronze. Now in China, of course, we all know of the Terracotta Army of China. What perhaps not everybody knows is that all of those ceramic warriors were armed with bronze weapons, real lethal weapons, and a particularly special one is the swords of the generals. These are bronze swords, so copper tin alloys, about 1 meter long, and the blade is sharpened using a rotary device, the earliest evidence we have of rotary sharpening. But then the core of the bronze has a rod made of copper. So you have the hardness of the bronze in the blade, and then the toughness of the copper in the core, which is another very clever choice. And I'll leave it at that, but I could carry on as you could imagine.
No, that's amazing. So in one of your current research projects, the European Research Council funded project titled Reverse Action, you are, among other exotic materials, investigating the collaborative creation and collective distribution of gold and gold ornaments in societies without coercive political administration, so without kings and emperors, for example. Could you tell us a little more about this research project in particular and the driving questions that underpin this project, perhaps the methods as well that you are employing to answer any of the questions you are posing with the project?
Sure, happily. This is a big and very complex, but also very exciting project that has quite a few of us involved in. So it's not just me, as you would imagine. But it's back to the earlier point, really, about the universal and then the particular to do with gold and with other so-called luxurious materials. So whenever we find gold or other luxurious materials, semi-precious stones or a particularly elaborate textile, and we find it in an archaeological context, or we as members of the public see it in a museum, we immediately associate it to some important individual, typically associated with power, wealth, and status. Explicitly or implicitly, we associate it to somebody who accumulated private wealth, normally correlated with power over other people, etc. But the reality is that this is not always necessarily the case, and archaeology throws plenty of evidence of societies with no such central extractive authority who benefited from the wealth of others, who, however, deployed resources to create intricate, sophisticated, and spectacular, beautiful objects with gold and other precious materials, even when they had to import the gold from elsewhere. So societies that had the complexity, the organizational power to deploy resources to something that is arguably useless from a utilitarian viewpoint, that requires complex training or long-distance trade, etc. And so that's interesting in itself, just visualizing the fact that artistic sophistication and technological complexity is not exclusive to strongly pyramidal societies. But then it also makes it interesting to ask the question of how this works in practice. How can the production of luxury objects be sustained in the long term when you don't have a central authority that ensures the supply, that ensures the learning and apprenticeship, that ensures that there is demand, etc. So this is what we are investigating in practice through doing scientific analysis of such luxurious objects in a range of archaeological contexts where, as I said, there's no evidence of state organizations. And so in analyzing their chemical composition, their microstructure, we try to understand where they got the raw materials from, perhaps make inferences about their learning traditions, how knowledge was transmitted among individuals, the extent to which there were specialists or not, interactions between different crafts and so on. And that's what's keeping us busy.
And do you have an example of such a making collective approach to perhaps something of gold that's being made by in a stateless society?
Sure, I can give you two examples from different contexts that we're working on. One is from pre-palatial Crete, so from Bronze Age Crete in the Mediterranean, where we always say it's where the first European states were created, it's the first state formation. But before those states existed, we find gold objects in tombs. And so archaeologists have historically tended to interpret these gold deposited in tombs as evidence of emergent inequality, that the first signs of people accumulating individual gold, marking themselves as different, and progressively, that would lead to the formation of stronger pyramids, state, etc. Now, if you look at these gold in themselves, what we have found is, on the one hand, that you have gold in practically every tomb. So gold is not just exclusive to certain individuals. Secondly, those tombs are collective rather than individual. So you're not assigning gold to an individual, but at best, at most to a group of people, however related they are. But third and most importantly, what we found is that the vast majority of the gold objects had been cut or ripped or fragmented before putting them in the tomb. And then what you find is different matching fragments of these gold in different tombs of the site, and sometimes even beyond a single site. And so this is a very visual example of gold that is not separating people, as we tend to regard gold, but actually uniting people, because we have people connected by matching fragments of gold objects, which I think is a very tangible example of how gold can unite rather than separate. To give you another example from our ongoing work in Colombia, the Muisca, who are the group of indigenous communities that lived in the eastern highlands around what today is Bogota, they are known to have invested enormous amounts of work in obtaining gold, because they have no gold geologically, and then turning it into artifacts. And so again, we might think that this is gold that would have been appropriated by a chief or an individual of sorts. But what we see is that the vast majority of this gold is then used to make offerings to the deities. So the gold is obtained and then offered for ritual purposes, or gifted to basically create diplomatic ties among communities. But the gold is not the private property of anyone, but rather is a communal resource that is communally managed, perhaps by individual intermediaries that will lead in the offering. But it's not gold that's being accumulated by individuals, but rather that is used for offerings and to mediate with the supernatural.
When you look at these societies approaching gold as a communal resource, sharing it across rather than wanting to keep it for themselves, is there then something to be said for them valuing it still at the same sort of level we do, as something really precious? Or do you think that has changed a little bit there?
I think that's yeah, of course it's a different way of valuing gold. And perhaps in our context, we are quite used to valuing everything, to basically connecting value with market price, because that's the way in which we operate. But of course, I'm sure you value your own work in ways different from what the market might dictate. And so if you take that to the extreme, we try to not understand the value of gold as necessarily just higher or lower, but different, then yes, you can see worlds such as ours, where the value of gold is predominantly, not exclusive, but predominantly one that has to do with wealth, is the major way, the main way of stocking wealth, as you know, though you can, of course, add or modify the value of gold when you give it a materiality in the form of jewelry. But in, for example, this world of the muisca that we were just talking about, gold surely has an economic value in that it's a commodity that needs to be obtained, surely in exchange for other things, but where it has a much more strong ritual value. And basically, gold is a medium for communicating between people, but also with the supernatural. And in that sense, the making of the gold offerings and the offering of the gold is probably more valuable than the gold itself. And so it's not a higher or lower value, but it certainly is a different way of understanding gold. And that's what would lead, of course, to the clash that happened when the Europeans got there.
So the social construct positioning gold as this highly valuable commodity, luxurious material is perhaps not really surprising. But then when we look at these alternative past approaches to distributing gold in these stateless societies, is there anything you think that we, in our current situation, could learn from those ancestors, perhaps in relation to sustainability and cross-craft interactions as well?
Well, I think at the most basic fundamental level, I think what we can immediately learn from this is that luxury can be shared. We tend to regard luxury as something that is used to separate the haves and the have-nots. And that's something associated to individuals who have restricted access to certain type of material, so usually connected to societies that are very strongly hierarchical, with power at the top, etc. If we look at luxury from the viewpoint of production, the maker, and we forget for a second about the consumption of luxury, the production of luxury can be shared. Anything that requires exceptional investment of material, labor, learning can be regarded as luxurious. And any society can, and indeed we show did, invest in luxury. So complexity, artistic sensitivity, religious and technical sophistication are not exclusive to states and empires and strongly hierarchical societies. So that's the overarching, I think, lesson that we can all bear in mind. More specifically, what we are trying to do with this project is also understand what made those cooperative societies and organizations more resilient. And for example, some of the hypotheses we are exploring are one, for example, to do with the supply of raw materials. We see that when organizations diversify the supply of raw materials rather than relying on a single source of whatever material it is you use, you are going to be more resilient because you don't have a king ensuring supply. Well, you have several suppliers, and so if there's a disruption to this network, you can rely on others. Something that appears to feature quite frequently in these forms of social and craft organization is a lot of cross-craft interaction. So you have specialists, but you also have shared workshop spaces that the community will use, whether you're working with stones or gold or pottery. And so they share tools, they share motifs, they share technical gestures, but at the same time, they also learn from one another. And so the knowledge network is stronger. There is a lot more of what anthropologists sometimes call peripheral participation or peripheral observation, which basically means novices hanging around, giving you a hand, learning today from you and tomorrow from somebody else. And all of that means that the knowledge network is stronger over time. And so, yeah, there are things I think that we can learn from past practice and potentially apply in the present world.
Yeah, it's quite interesting to think about those shared knowledge hubs for craft skills, because when you look at craft skills today, not so much with jewelry, because there is a lot of action from British Academy of Jewelry and other places to try and keep traditional skills alive, but perhaps also glasswork, etc., where glass blowing skills have pretty much vanished from the UK. There's only very few people who are left. So sustainability from material resources, but sustainability in terms of technique also sounds interesting, because you certainly have many people who have observed and been part of these processes, so they are also sharing that.
Absolutely, and I think it's quite challenging in your world. I imagine in that on the one hand you want for your knowledge to be shared and sustained over time, but at the same time I suppose you all have or may have your own trade secrets that you want to retain so that your work is different from that of the next jeweler. And but yeah, I don't have a solution for that. But more generally, I agree that sometimes saving this traditional knowledge for posterity is critical, and that sometimes requires creative approaches. And as part of the reverse action project in Colombia in particular, we are trying to work with craftspeople from indigenous communities and beyond as well. And we are finding this interaction very fertile because, of course, with indigenous communities, often they've been displaced and marginalized, and they are struggling to retain or recover their traditional knowledge in crafts and beyond. But we can work with them, and on the one hand, they can help us understand the objects we are looking at, because nobody better than a goldsmith or a weaver to help us understand how this particular object was made, or where the pinch points were in terms of the technology, and how hard or not it was to make them, etc. And what we can share with them sometimes is information about what clay sources were used in the past and work particularly well, or what are the traditional natural dyes that textile makers used as opposed to the artificial ones that are being used today. So there's potential for interesting synergies there that at the same time give these craftspeople potential new areas of activity, sometimes just for public engagement demonstrations or to create now reproductions for museums and shops. So yeah, it's an interesting area of work and of intersection between academia and the real world.
The project, in summary, aims to provide a new perspective on collective action, now looking at sort of luxury items. Could you share a little bit more about collective action as a concept, and why you thought it was interesting to think it in terms of luxury?
Sure. Collective action, as you know, is a broad term used in many contexts, but I suppose in general what it means is an action taken by a group of people voluntarily to achieve a goal that will bring benefit to everyone. So in talking about collective action, we are prioritizing horizontal relations as opposed to top-down, persuasion over coercion, the communal versus the individual, or indeed authority rather than power, because there may be people with more authority, more persuasive, more respected, but not that coercive power with the ability to, or the power to punish others. So collective action is today, of course, very current, because some people will argue that it's the only way to solve world challenges, from nuclear disarmament to climate change. But there's now archaeologists, well, for quite a few decades, but I suppose now with increasing emphasis, so not just us, but others surely, looking at potential examples or evidence of collective action in the past, along the lines of what I was saying earlier, not to assume that everything is an early sign of hierarchy and centralization. And so while archaeologists are looking at that mostly in terms of shared practices to ensure subsistence, for example, the construction of irrigation channels to ensure sustainable agriculture, which can be done communally, or building a house or a temple, we are focusing specifically as to whether collective action may also have been behind the production of luxurious, useless, if you like, objects like the ones we are discussing. Because in the absence of power authority saying, you shall do this, there must have been other way, and that other way may have been voluntary cooperation and agreement that this is something that as a community we want to have. We want to create these objects for particular purposes.
The object that you have been looking at, when you class them as luxury, the idea to me, the sort of objects that function in terms of connecting to the afterlife, or they have a very important function because they believed that this was not just to wear as an ornamental piece of jewelry to sort of, feel more beautiful. It's a different function. Have you seen different functions within the project?
Yes, of course. And that's where, again, we can talk about gold, the material, but then the cultural specific materialities of gold. And so there are, for example, societies where the gold objects you can see had very long lives. So they have very strong evidence of curation, repair, passing down generations, modifications. And with that, of course, accumulating long, rich life histories that affect to the value. In other groups, you have gold that was clearly made and then deposited almost immediately with no signs. Sometimes they're not even properly, what we would call properly finished, polished, etc. They still have traces of the mold stuck in them. So they are made for deposition. There are cultures that prioritize the visual, so getting the maximum size relative to volume. So they work with very thin hammered sheets covering other substrates, so they look golden, whereas other societies will prioritize the tiny granulation, the embossing, the tiny detail that you only appreciate under a microscope. So all of those things and more. And some people make body ornaments, whereas other people make things that are not to be worn. So in each of those practices, we are seeing different forms of cultural behavior around the same universal material.
When we talk about luxurious products today, we consider them to be the useless ones, but yeah, the ones that are about connecting to the afterlife, would you class them as that useless?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Sue. And obviously, I use useless as a shorthand, and perhaps I shouldn't, to refer to things that are not solving immediate utilitarian practical problems. So they are not about food and shelter; they are about something else. And of course, the fact that really all societies around the world, from Neanderthals, it now seems clear, invested in these sorts of things, in art, in ornaments, in luxury. It shows that they are necessary. And we all know, you and I know, that we need this stuff. We need more than food and shelter. It's part of being human. And so, of course, they are necessary. Of course, they are useful, just in a different dimension.
The function of sort of ornamenting oneself feels very different than the function of sort of making sure that you will reach the afterlife, for example, or that. So I wondered if there was any sort of more objects that are connected to what we could consider luxurious today than those connected to the afterlife.
In this project, quite deliberately, we are taking a very broad definition of luxury, precisely to allow for all of those things and to problematize quite deliberately that idea of luxury as being exclusive to certain individuals, etc. We're saying this is a luxury too, because luxury it's got that kind of ambivalent connotation that we say, oh, it's bad because it's differentiated the haves and the have-nots. But at the same time, we see it as desirable. And here I am telling you that it is a luxury to be with you here today. So we say, so if luxury is a good thing, it is a good thing that is within the reach of many, because as archaeology demonstrates, from the production side of things, there is a lot of luxury and a lot of uses, and it doesn't need to mean an individual who's accumulating and showing off.
In revealing success stories of these crafts in the past, you aim to provide examples of sustainable materials and traditional techniques to modern craftspeople. And you say this on your webpage, who struggle to retain uniqueness in the face of industrialization. This to me is super interesting. Could you elaborate on this aim and how you think any listeners could perhaps enhance cooperation in the current context and sort of stand in the face of industrialization?
Yeah, that's a tricky one, and I have to start by saying that that's an overarching ambition where we hope to make a modest contribution, but I don't think we will solve this problem completely. But it is along the lines of what I was mentioning earlier when we are trying to engage with present-day cooperatives of artisans in Colombia that are often trying to recreate or to give some continuity to traditional crafts, ceramics, goldsmithing, a lot of textile making. And so, of course, it's very hard for them to compete with modern industry. And so I suppose their claim is that of authenticity, for however you define that. And together, as I said, through their helping us study the indigenous pre-Hispanic objects, and through us sharing our findings with them, we can potentially together find a way, find individual, at least individual things, such as which clay to select. And we are doing this with one project in Southern Colombia, trying to find the clays that were used in the past so that present-day potters can go to the same place, or in producing, particular goldsmithing techniques that they may find that are more, that have deeper roots. So they will be able to claim that authenticity, but also make themselves different from the larger corporations. At the same time, in some cases, they will make it more environmentally sustainable if they shift back to their traditional, for example, natural dyes for their textiles. And at the same time, something that we can learn mutually is those forms of organization, as we were talking about before, because we can see how cooperatives work today, but we can also try to understand how they worked in the past and see if there's some common knowledge of the actual operational logistics of sustainable cooperations. Because the reality is that in some of these archaeological societies, we have sustainable practices lasting for centuries. So there must have been something they were doing right.
I think that's a very interesting shift of thinking when you think collectively, okay, this also sharing what has this person in the local environment, so that you don't need to purchase things from far away. Or I think that there's some lessons to be learned there as well.
Exactly, and that's something perhaps pooling resources with other craftspeople, with other practitioners. There may be some economies to be made while still allowing for each of you to do your individual creations. And of course, this is not something I'm inventing today, but it is along those lines that I think there is perhaps scope for more exploration and experimentation.
It's interesting to investigate collective action in relation to luxurious materials and these high-skilled technologies. It's hypothesized this helped sustain complex technologies, but also potentially limited innovation. Could you tell us a little bit about this hypothesis?
Yes, this is, I should emphasize, a hypothesis. So something that we are investigating, not something that to keep us focused, but we'll have to talk in some time to see if we get at a final answer. But basically, the underlying principle. So one of our hypotheses is that ritual helps sustain these technologies, complex technologies over time, but that it may have limited innovation. So what we are saying is that in the absence of central coercive political authorities, often it is the world of ritual that acts as the main drive, the main demand for luxury complex objects. So we're not making gold jewelry for the king, but we're making gold offerings for the deity. And so that is the main motor, and that's pretty well established. But then the challenge is that rituals, as we all know, by definition, tend to be repetitive, because that's how we understand a wedding as a ritual or a funeral as a ritual. We may add particular spins to it, but in essence, they need to keep certain elements so that we all understand them and the deities understand them. And so if you constrain your craft creation to the world of ritual, that may have constrained the scope for dramatic innovations. Now, as I said, it's a hypothesis, which may prove to be false, but that we're investigating by looking at diachronic changes over time of different craft practices. Because the flip side of the coin is that we're also exploring the possibility that there was a lot of, as we were saying earlier, shared workspaces, cross-craft interactions. And we know that those are very active spurs for innovation. That when, it's on the borders or overlapping borders of our areas of expertise that we can be more creative and invent new things, etc. And so that's an interesting paradox to be investigated. So if we are in the world of ritual, but we are interacting with other crafts, are we going to be inventive? But will the ritual context allow for it? But it's an interesting question, but we don't know yet what the answer will be.
You are in the project until 2026, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
Have there been any major findings that you're already willing to share?
Well, I think we've done a lot of where we have a lot of results that we are at different stages of processing. So I'm hesitant to tell you anything that's very conclusive. We have a few publications out already, which are on our website that I encourage everyone to go and visit, riversaction.org, a bilingual Spanish-English website where we have academic publications, but also links to videos and other outputs. And so, yeah, so we have results. We've conducted a lot of analysis of gold in Colombia in particular, so we can identify the potentially different sources of gold along the lines of diversifying the supply that I was mentioning earlier. We have done countless analysis of ceramics, not only chemistry, but in terms of their morphology, searching for individual hands, because different potters will have, again, different technical gestures. By analyzing the 3D models of their pots that are typologically identical, we can identify what we think are idiosyncratic ways of making pots that might speak of craft organization and where we have apprentices, etc. We are beginning, well, we've done already some work, but we are developing further work on textiles as well from different regions of Colombia. So we have several open fronts. We are next week we will be in the conference in Colombia, next month in another one in Melbourne, presenting some of these results. Stay tuned, go to our website, and we will keep sharing also on our social media.
Finally, my last question, Marcos, is what's next for this research and for research for you in this area or other areas? Is there anything that you have in the future vision sort of that you would be willing to share?
Sure. We've recently, as in January this year, started a new project that has very little to do with gold and, well, the sort of things that we've been talking about in scope, but it also engages jewelry. And this is a project focused on the typographic punches of John Baskerville. So Baskerville was an 18th century maverick in the world of letterpress printing, who designed the Baskerville font, which we recognize from all of us having it on our computers. That's a present day not very good version. We will create a better one in this project. But he created a new font. He experimented a lot with the materials and the engraving of the typographic punches of iron, which he used to create the types for the printing press, experimented with ink, with paper. So he was one of those people that, like many of you goldsmiths, are at the intersection between the artistic design and then the material challenge. And luckily for us, his collection of typographic punches has survived, and it's here in Cambridge. And so we are reverse engineering it. We are studying these punches to understand how he went about designing and creating them, and using those as a casing point to engage with present, and for that to understand that we are engaging with jewelers and engravers and metallists today, but also with historians of typography, present day typeface designers, letterpress printers. And so it's part research, part engagement and shared practice to try to understand better what how these punches were made and used. But also, again, trying to revitalize a little bit letterpress printing, which is another craft that is in serious danger of disappearing in the digital age. So it's another very exciting project that is in the making. I cannot now announce the website because it's not been released yet, but look out for it because the website will be launched very soon.
When we hear gold, we think of crowns, wedding rings symbolizing the value of love, and large vaults protecting shimmering gold bars bought by investors. But if gold was once used as part of the cooperative production of luxury items, one can wonder, what if we were to change the paradigm now? Someone who has dedicated time and attention to investigating this question as part of a large research team is Marcos. To expand collective action studies to the cooperative production of luxury items is most interesting, and posing the hypothesis that a decentralized and diverse approach to material supply, as well as an alternative approach to workshops as these informal spaces where makers share tools and materials, sustained the perseverance of complex technical knowledge and resulted in distribution of gold amongst a stateless population is really most compelling. So for your efforts in unraveling these stories and contemplating their impact, for all of your contributions to date, and for your time today, I would like to thank you very much, Marcos. We look forward to seeing what you will be publishing about this project and all the research you will do in the future.
Thank you, Sophie. Thank you for having me. It's been fun to talk.
Next month, I'll be joined by another guest, so watch this space to find out who it is. But for now, this was Sophie Boons for the BHA podcast episode titled Repositioning Gold with Professor Marcos Martinón-Torres. Thank you for listening and have a wonderful day.